So they were pulling like 15 Gs for the first turn. And like Red Bull, the air race organization, thought it was awesome. Like they were announcing it over the intercom, like how many Gs they were pulling and stuff like that. And a guy named Eric Zivko, who owns Zivko, who makes the edges, happened to be there. And apparently, Mr. Zivko was not very happy that they were pulling 15 Gs in his airplane. So he's the one that put the number that you had to have. It can only be 12 Gs.
Well, and kind of, I guess I should have prefaced it. Where I'm curious is, the fact just like density altitude, right? Someone who's not very smart like me, I at least know that's going to change like throughout the day as it warms up.
Yep.
And you mentioned humidity. So the guy who's first out the gate in Fort Worth, Texas, right, where it's probably 80 degrees, by the time, 2 or 3 hours later, now it's 95, 98 degrees. You're at I would imagine, I think, a significant disadvantage from the guy who flew, an hour or 2 hours prior to you. Is that not, I mean, how does that factor in?
Yeah, luckily the way the format works is the head-to-head thing. So usually the person you're flying against is all that really matters, and usually you're within a couple minutes of those guys. So
Okay.
that's really all that matters. Qualifying for the race on Saturday is usually where you'll see a pretty big difference because that'll last, hour and a half or something. So it might be an hour and a half from the first guy to the last guy. And like you're talking about, a lot of things can change. The wind could die down. The wind can increase. And that's just kind of luck of the draw. But when you get on race day and it's head-to-head, you're within a couple minutes of whoever you're directly competing against to get to the next round. So it doesn't usually have that much of effect. What you'll see is when you're head-to-head and you're doing all that and you're going through the race, the first group that flies might be faster or slower than the last group that flies as a whole just because of the conditions changing.
Okay.
So, let's just say the first group does a 55 second and a 56 second, and then the last group does a 58 second and a 59 second. It's not because those pilots are any worse than the first group. It's just because the conditions have changed in whatever way to make it slower or faster.
Gotcha. Other thing, so how much does it matter? So if you're going head-to-head competition, are you guys taking off at the same time one guy's holding entering the track, or is it you have racer 1 takes off, flies the track, then racer 2 takes off? Because I would imagine too, like if you're holding, you're burning, I don't know, a gallon, 2 gallons of gas, like all of those things come into play when you're talking a tenth of a second.
Yeah, so that's where so we're sanctioned by the FAI. So after the race, so there's a minimum takeoff weight that you have to make, and there's also a minimum landing weight. So you take off pretty much at the same time. When you get out of the airplane is reweighed. So before you take off, the pilot and the airplane's weighed at race weight. So with gas, with smoke oil, and you have to make the minimum weight. When you come back, the airplane goes on the scales, the pilot gets on the scales, and there's a certain percentage. I don't know what the percentage is. That's Jason's job, not mine, to make sure so you can only move the weight a certain percentage.
Okay.
So that's how they keep all that fair. So the airplanes and the pilots are constantly weighed to stay as fair as possible on that. But before that, you're exactly right. People would take off, and whoever the first guy was to fly would be at a weight disadvantage because the guy in the hold would be out there full rich, wide open, burning as much gas as possible, trying to make it as light as possible. So it was interesting before the Red Bull Air Race, the way it progressed is because the pilots just got smart. Like you'd see people taxiing around at 1,800 RPM, just dragging the brakes, burning gas, trying to make it lighter, right? So then the organization's like, okay, you can't do that. And then you had people out there full rich, just burning as much gas. Like, okay, well, you can't do that. So that's when, the rule book is this big in the beginning, and now it's this big now because people like Kirby and Michael and those guys have just continuously
Find a way.
pushed the rules. So, like we got our rule book 2 weeks ago, and it's Paulo's job not to read the rules. It's Paulo's job to read what the rules don't say. So don't read what they say. I want you to read what they don't say. And
Yeah.
that's what I want you to focus on. You read in between the lines. You don't read the lines. And that's why every year the rule book just gets a little bit bigger because there's a lot of smart people that are out there trying to find an advantage.
And this, I mean, now thinking about it too, right? Like even your weight, because as you get the plane get modified, I imagine 12 ounces here, 4 ounces there, everything that you can trim off that plane and make it more efficient is critical. So even you, I would think, in the pilot weight, I mean, is that a factor or is that not something?
For sure, it's a factor. So right now I'm at 170 pounds, and that's a really comfortable spot for me. That's just kind of where I am all the time. That's just where my body wants to be. Paulo wants me under 160 because every pound that I can lose, we can move. Every pound the airplane loses, and every pound that I lose, we can put weight where we want it. And as a pilot, uh,
Yeah.
where the weight is matters a lot. For the race, we want an aft CG, so it'll turn better. So every pound that I lose is a pound that we can put in the tail or wherever Paulo decides that he wants to put it. So, yeah, it's extremely big deal. It gets so crazy that, guys are, I mean, it's ridiculous what we'll do for literally ounces. Uh, if you take a half-inch screw that's usually in the cowling, and it's got 4 threads coming through it, and you only want 1 thread, you'll shave it down 3 threads. So, you'll take that much off of a screw to save that much weight. But if you do that on 100 screws, it's like, it's not enough to do anything. It's like ounces still. But
Right.
every little bit counts. So people are grinding down screws where there's just enough to come through the nut plates. It's people see the race and they, obviously it's entertaining and it's fun to watch and all that stuff. But if people only knew all the craziness that goes into making these airplanes fast and making them light, it's just amazing and mind blowing how much goes into it.
How much gas do you burn during a race?
Yeah, so I can give you an estimate. It
Yeah.
depends. So, like, it depends on how you've got the engine set up and what you're doing with the engine mixture wise. But the minimum takeoff fuel, I think it's 12 gallons. Most of the time, you'll burn 6 or 7 gallons, kind of thing, is what it is. So
Okay.
it's not that much fuel because there's a lot to do with it. It depends on how far the racetrack is from the race airport. Depends on what kind of strategy you're trying to use. There's a lot that goes into it. So it's always evolving and it's always changing. And it'll be different from pilot to pilot.
I might be thinking about it too much, but you're trying to move that CG aft. You're inking every last ounce of weight out of the plane. And I know it's a short race, but is a plane, does it change its handling characteristics throughout that race, or is it too short to notice?
It's too short to notice. Yeah, you want um, the way that the length of the race and the way the airplanes are set up, you don't notice like fuel burn or anything like that if that's what you're asking. It's like as you
Yeah.
burn, if you have it set up for ferry flying, as you burn fuel off, you'll feel the CG come forward on the edges. But the race, the way the fuel is and all that kind of stuff, you won't feel any change at all with it.
Yeah. So again, this is kind of like flying different planes, right? Like there's some things I just never have to worry about, but I think about other planes you'd have to worry about. Accelerated stalls and things like that. Is that a factor? I know the Red Bull capped the G's at some point to like 12.
Yep,
I might
it's
make
12.
that up. Was the rationale behind that? Are you worried about accelerated stalls? Is that a thing or no?
Yeah. So you'll see that in VTMs or vertical turning maneuvers, which is basically just a half cube and how we turn around. That's where you make up the most time in a racetrack, or that's where you have the opportunity to make up the most time in a racetrack if you do it properly. And you'll see guys hit high speed stalls all the time, and depends on how big and how deep in the stall you get. It'll cost you a second and a half, which is huge because you're winning by tenths of a second. So if you do hit a high speed stall, you're done. The reason why the G rule came into place, Jason tells this story all the time. It must have been like 2006 or 2007 when the Red Bull race kind of first started going, and as the rule book started growing, they were in, I think it was Berlin, and there was no speed limit rule. So now you come in at 200 knots ground speed. They have all these computers on the airplane, and they're very sophisticated. They know everything that you do. So you come in at 200 knots, and it's judged by the computer. If you go faster, you can be DQ'd and all that kind of stuff. So, but in the early days, before they had all this figured out, there was no speed limit. So you could just go as high as you wanted to and just dive it in, and whoever was the bravest would be going the fastest, right? So Jason always tells a story of Kirby and Mike Mangold in Berlin. It was a track, and the first turn was basically like a 110 degree right turn. So you had to go through the start gate and then back over to your right. Well, Kirby and Mike Mangold were just crazier than everybody else, I guess. And they would start at like 6,000 feet and just push the throttle forward and just dive it into the first gate. So they were pulling like 15 Gs for the first turn. And like Red Bull, the air race organization, thought it was awesome. Like they were announcing it over the intercom, like how many Gs they were pulling and stuff like that. And a guy named Eric Zivko, who owns Zivko, who makes the edges, happened to be there. And apparently, Mr. Zivko was not very happy that they were pulling 15 Gs in his airplane. So he's the one that put the number that you had to have. It can only be 12 Gs because of the manufacturing specs. So the G rule came because of Mike Mangold and Kirby Chambliss being, I don't know the right word for it, braver than everybody else and pulling 14 and a half and 15 Gs in a Zivko edge.
Well, it's like, is it plus or minus 12? Is that the manufacturer?
Right.
Yeah. So
that's how they got the plus 12 number. Yeah.
There's an engineering limit, right, of 150% or something.
Right.
That's probably.
But those guys didn't care. They just want to win a race. They don't care how many Gs they're pulling or anything or whatever, you know. So, so that was when there was no speed limit. So you just go as high as you wanted to and just dive it in. So then, they're like, okay, well, you can't do that. Now you're going to have a helicopter hovering at 1,000 feet, and you got to be below the helicopter. When you come by the helicopter, if you're not below it, you're DQ'd. Well, that didn't matter. Then they just went to 10,000 feet and just screamed down through the helicopter because you had to be level, and then they still had the same speed. So then they're like, okay, so that's how we got the ground speed rule. So now 200 knots ground speed is how we have the start rule. So again, just those guys reading in between the lines, reading what the rule book doesn't say, not what it does say. And that's why the rule book is just continuously growing and getting bigger.
That's why the Navy gets to do whatever they want, because they look at it, it's like, what does the rule book, what does it say? If it doesn't say I can't do it, then you can do it. Air Force is, if it's not in the rule book, you can't do it.
Yeah.
It tells you what you can do. So I like that style. Just, it's not in the rule book, so go do it. Go change the rules.
Yeah, so Paulo gets paid to read in between the lines and read what it doesn't say.
Yeah, that's wild. I had no idea. So when they put that speed limit cap on it, did it drastically change?
Oh, for sure. Because, I don't know how well you know Kirby. He's a funny guy. The red line on a edge is 230 knots or whatever. And this, in the early days, they didn't have all the sophisticated computers on the airplanes. And so I know the number of indicated airspeed that they were seeing at that race in Berlin. I'm not going to say it, but let's just say it was well over the red line. So they were going super fast.
Yeah, making it happen.
Yeah,
hey, if you want to win, you got to go fast.
Well, that's the thing. So Jason tells a story of watching Mike Mangold do it, and Kirby's like, "Look at that idiot!" And he does a fast time, and next time Kirby just did it even more. So it's just the way the race works is if you want to win, you just got to do a little bit more than the next guy. So they just kept getting higher, 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 and going faster, faster, and faster, and pulling harder, harder, and harder. And it is what it is.